firstly, I want to thank you all for being here today for our session on managing conflicts of interest in health and medical research. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm dialing in from today, the Turrbal and Yagara people here in Meanjin, Brisbane. And extend all respect to all traditional owners across Australia, as well as any First Nations peoples joining us on this webinar. I would like to also pay my respect to their ancestors and descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. And these lands have always been places of teaching, learning, research and collaboration. First of all, I would just like to do a bit of housekeeping and just ask that if you have any questions before we get into this, that you do pop it in our Q&A. We will do our best to answer anything there and not in the chat or pop up a hand. We've got a lot of people online today. And on that note, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Nitya Phillipson from the Murdoch Children's Research Institution in Melbourne. Nitya, I will hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Sophie, and thanks for having me here today. I'm going to share my slides now. Do bear with me. Thank you for your kind introduction, Sophie. I'm Nitya Phillipson. I am the Head of Governance and Integrity at the Murdoch Children's Research Institute. And today we're going to be talking about managing conflicts of interest in health and medical research. And before we start, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I'm here in Flemington in Melbourne, so I'm joining you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to extend my respect to any Indigenous elders we have with us here today, and to extend that respect and gratitude to any colleagues and friends we have on the call as well. Okay, so today we've got roughly an hour together to get through quite a lot of meaty stuff, which I'm really excited about. But before we start, this is talk on conflicts of interest. So I have to start by disclosing, of course, any conflicts of interest. So I don't have much to disclose today other than to let you know I am the Head of Integrity. So that means my role here at the Institute is responsible for managing conflicts of interest at the organisation. I don't have any financial or non-financial conflicts of interest to disclose in this setting. But I do want to take this opportunity to let you know about the way I've used AI, which I think is how these disclosures are slightly evolving, and to let you know that I did use GPT-4 to help me with some of the definitions and questions. I, of course, checked all these and ended up rewriting many of them, as is the way. And I used the literature review tool Elicit to help me revisit some of the literature in this space. And I, of course, had to read all the papers myself too, but I just wanted to go through my disclosures as well. So what are we going to do today? I was hoping this would be a very interactive session, but with this many people on the call, we'll just do our best to get through the content and hopefully do some activities along the way. But do reach out in the Q&A if you've got any questions, thoughts, musings of anything I've said today. And we're going to cover the role of the Australian Code and some guides that have been helping us along the way. We're going to define conflicts of interest, go through some famous cases, and then talk about how individuals can manage conflicts of interest and hopefully some strategies on how organisations can do that too. So let's crack on. We're going to start with a poll, and that is to ask you, when was the last time you formally declared a conflict of interest? And I'll ask you to dig deep and be honest. When was the last time you did it? Was it within the past month? Was it within the past year? A couple of years ago, more than 3 years ago, or never? And no, there are no wrong answers here. Please just let me know. I do this to try and gauge how au fait we are with this kind of practice, but also to sort of see what's happening across the polls and the zones that we're joining from. And of course, I would be ticking within the past month, and then I formally just disclosed my relevant interests, as it were, no conflicts in this talk. So hopefully you're all clicking away. I don't think I can vote. No, I can't, which is probably for the best.
So far I got 70, nearly 80%.
Oh, great. All right. Well, let's see. These aren't meant to be, of course. We're not doing any of these files just to get a sense of them. Can you throw up the findings for me, please?
Sure.
Cheers. Excellent. Okay, what a great spread. So we've got some people doing, 16% of people doing it sort of fairly regularly in the past month, all the way through to 32% doing that never. And I want you to know that no matter what you clicked is, of course, totally fine. If you have relevant interests that you need to disclose regularly, then of course that's work you're doing and you're clicking on that within the past month, and that's fine. If you have never disclosed a conflict of interest because you don't have one, that is also fine. Of course it is. But it's kind of nice to sit there and think about how regularly and often we're doing this, and maybe tweak some of you to go, it's been a couple of years since I looked at my conflict of interest management plan. Maybe I should dust it off as well. So thank you for participating. Okay, so one of the things that I guess I wanted to address is, why is the head of integrity, research integrity, managing a conflict of interest portfolio? I know that this is commonly a role that is done by legal teams, and I work very closely with our legal team here at MCRI and our general counsel to do this work. Sometimes it's done by people and culture teams, sometimes it's done exclusively by the ethics and governance office. So I just wanted to say the reason why me as head of integrity for the Institute is managing this becomes clear when we look at the kind of regulations and managing or guiding health and medical research. And that is, of course, for all of us, the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. We call that colloquially the Code. And it sort of is our go-to document when it comes to how we responsibly do our research. I won't go into it. I'm sure you've all read this. It's by the bedside table, putting you to sleep every night. But it is a document that sets out the expectations about how research is to be conducted, and hopefully responsibly, and of course ethically and with integrity. It sets out some principles and responsibilities. And importantly for this talk, it is supported by guides that give us detailed examples on how we can comply with our principles of the code. And as you can see on the screen, we've got a whole guide dedicated to disclosures of interests and management of conflicts of interest. And for all of us to receive research funding through our core funders, the NHMRC and ARC and MRFF, it is an obligation that we meet, and the regulations and guidelines set out here. So when we think about the principles, there's lots of them, and they're fairly common sense, I have to say. None of these surprised me when I looked at the revised code. But today, I guess the core principle we want to be looking at is this one of transparency. And we will keep on coming back to transparency today because it is the core principle really underpinning the work we do in this space. So how does the NHMRC define a conflict of interest? Well, that document defines it as a situation where an independent observer might reasonably conclude that the professional actions of a person are or may be unduly influenced by other interests. And that is a lot of words, isn't it? That's a lot of meaty words that are trying to describe, I think, a concept that we all know fairly well, but struggle with when we really get down into the weeds and interrogate it. And that's because there are loads of different types of conflicts of interest. There are certainly different types when it comes to the financial or non-financial conflicts of interest, but also conflicts of interest in relation to our relationships and our institutions' relationships too. And in health and medical research, which feels like a big industry, but actually is quite small, and everyone knows everyone, and we have lots of pockets of expertise and collaborations, these relational and institutional conflicts of interest can become quite pressing. And it's not just the different types, it's the different ways of observing conflicts of interest too that we need to get our head around. So we've got actual conflicts of interest, and rather than reading that out, I'm going to highlight the words italicized there. It's where we're thinking about direct influence. That's what makes it an actual conflict of interest, where a researcher's judgments are directly influenced by their competing interest. And I've got an example here. You may or may not agree with me that this is an actual conflict of interest because it's fairly common in some areas. There are researchers receiving consultancy fees, or has in the past, for a medical device manufacturer, and they're now running a trial on that device. That may have arisen in your organisation. A potential conflict of interest is one where that word could becomes important, that the competing interest could influence or be seen to influence that decision or work. And an example I've given here, again, that happens more often than we realise, is a researcher being involved in drafting a policy whilst then pursuing patents in that same field. That is very naturally going to occur in certain areas. And then we've got this notion of a perceived conflict of interest, and that's really going back to that pub test. It's where a reasonable person might think that a researcher's judgment could be influenced, even if we realise that it's not. It's that perception that becomes important. And for the audience today, I've given the example of a hospital ethics committee member or any ethics committee member reviewing a protocol led by their close colleague or friend. And that certainly happened to me. And there's a perceived conflict of interest there that we need to think about and manage. So I want you to stop and think for a minute. I mean, if there were a few of us on the Zoom, I'd get us to kind of have breakout rooms, but I want you to stop for a second and think about in your respective roles. And I know we've got people from all across I just noticed there's some echoing. Sorry, hopefully, Shirley, that's fixed for you. But I want you to just reflect on what's the trickiest conflict of interest you've seen in your area. Was it a financial one? I feel like they're very common. They're very obvious. They hit us around the head with a bit of a stick of we've got this clear financial conflict of interest. And I know that because when I think about the conflicts of interest that I see that maybe lend some of the trickiest scenarios, they're often the non-financial conflicts of interest. They're the perceived non-financial conflicts of interest that are ones that in health and medical research in particular, because of the different hats many of our colleagues wear, become really hard to navigate. And look, I ask that you put them in the chat maybe if you want to chat amongst yourselves whilst we're talking about what you think are some of the trickiest conflicts of interest you've seen in your roles and telling. So this is a very busy slide and I apologize, but it's because this field is really busy. I wanted to look at some of the prevalences and the consequences of conflicts of interest, especially when they're mismanaged, because that's what we're really worried about, right? And, you know, when we look across the different academic fields, we're seeing definite concerns around conflicts of interest not being managed. We've got IBAC more commonly involved in these reports. We're seeing certain fields like tobacco, maybe those and vaping coming up as conflicts of interest again. And it's becoming clear that the prevalence is kind of high. And I wanted to focus on this one paper here that said 1 in 4. So this was a really interesting article that came out in 2022 by Flood and colleagues, and there was a lot of media pickup and interest in this space that cited that 1 in 4 medical researchers failed to declare their conflict of interest. And they did that by looking at the company's reports. And I think they used a lot of Medicines Australia reporting to do that, as well as individual company and pharma companies self-reporting. And then they went back to journal articles, presentations, and submissions of self-reported conflicts of interest and married the two. And they did that across 120 clinical trials. And they found that 1 in 4 Australian authors in this study hadn't declared a conflict. Now, there might have been a valid reason for that. Maybe it wasn't a real conflict as they saw it, or maybe the, human error or whatever it was. But there was this notion of 1 in 4, and the dollar amounts were actually reasonably high. So when we think about this, we start to see a bit of a pattern of this being something that we need to build into our everyday, because the consequences can be fairly substantial. And to do that, I was going to do some hypothetical case studies, but I think it's actually really worthwhile looking at some famous cases. And so, of course, I've picked the most egregious cases to hopefully highlight some of the kind of deep-seated and long-running consequences of this type of work. But of course, I'm sure you could have given me some non-famous cases as well. So I'm going to start off with Charles Nemiroff. I don't know if many of you know about this case. It's certainly one that I followed with some interest back in the day. He was a US psychiatrist. He remains a US psychiatrist and then chair at Emory University. And a long-standing Senate probe found that he failed to disclose over $1 million in personal payments from pharmaceutical industry companies whilst he was conducting National Institute of Health, that's the US Health Agency's funded research. And really worryingly, some of these payments related to drugs he was actively evaluating through his NIH funding research. So a large-scale investigation was undertaken, and NIH actually suspended Emory from applying for grants, and that's the organisation, not the individual. So then Professor Nemiroff moved organisations after this and was able to actually obtain quite substantial NIH funding at a different university the next year. And this sparked really major reforms in the sector, in the health and medical research sector in particular, on how we view the obligations of not just organisations, but as individuals on how we manage conflicts of interest. And I think it certainly had influence over here as well. And these links are all active. Please take a look. I'm not saying anything that's not in the public domain, so please feel free. We'll send out these slides and you can take a look at these links as well. Hopefully all of you, if not many of you, know about Andrew Wakefield. For those of you who do not, Andrew Wakefield was a UK gastroenterologist who published this rather famous study that incorrectly linked the MMR vaccine, that's measles, mumps and rubella vaccine, to autism. He published that in The Lancet in 1998. And it was a study based on 12 children. And the study to this day has triggered quite sharp falls in vaccination rates and vaccine scares. And look, there's a whole research integrity investigation that was undertaken, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but you should read this book if you get a chance. It's fairly riveting stuff. But I want to talk about his undisclosed conflicts of interest, because he was actually paid by lawyers preparing lawsuits against vaccine manufacturers. So he was very directly in competition there with the work that he was doing. And he had actually filed a patent for an alternative measles vaccines. And whilst he has said that this did not impact his research, it's really important to know that he did not disclose these very pertinent conflicts of interest to his readers, to his institutions, nor to the publishers of this paper. The Lancet article is fully retracted for a number of reasons, not just this. And many studies have been conducted that widely refute this claim. But the case is now cited as one of the most catastrophic and most high examples of research misconduct, but also I think the insidiousness of that undisclosed conflict of interest and the harm it can have. So when we think about consequences then, and I'm not doing this to scare us, it's just to kind of, I guess, highlight some of the issues that can arise, is harm. People are harmed by these decisions to not disclose, and our participants were harmed, not us, of course, but in this study, patients and participants were harmed. And as you've seen, it can lead to sanctions, retractions, as well as legal consequences. And just to kind of be clear on what I mean by that, I wanted to go through some of the kind of sanctions or consequences that can arise out of these cases. Research misconduct, which I know not all organisations use as a definition, but by the code is defined as a serious breach of the code that is intentional, reckless or negligent, can be found for really substantial cases of undisclosed conflicts of interest. We then move into the really serious category of criminal conduct, and this is the Victorian IBAC definition, or I pulled out from the Victorian IBAC, but of course we all have our own anti-corruption commissions. And corrupt conduct then also becomes a concern too, with this kind of dishonesty or concealment, breach of public trust, and that misuse of resources and authority. And for the public health colleagues in the room, those that work at hospitals, all of these organisations have actually a mandatory obligation to report unmanaged conflicts of interest if they lean towards corrupt conduct. So this can get serious pretty quickly. And in the case of Andrew Wakefield, the definition of fraud, or at least a boiled down definition of fraud, is deception for financial gain. And I think it's very easy to see how this could be construed as a deception for financial gain. So the stakes are pretty high. But actually, this isn't the stuff that keeps me up at night, rather worryingly. I don't lose sleep over things like this. I lose sleep over how undisclosed, unmanaged conflicts of interest undermine trust in research. And I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but given the kind of environment we're operating in, I feel like trust in research is something we have to hold very dearly in our hands, and we need to treat it with the respect it deserves. And just one lever we can put in that space is to disclose our conflicts of interest. Okay, so what does this teach us? Hopefully that disclosures is just non-negotiable. We have to be upfront on our conflicts of interests. But that management is actually essential too. And we need to talk about them in managing them in ways that are really, really feasible. And I'll give some ideas on how at least we've approached this next. That institutions that share this responsibility. It's really easy to say, well, staff member X never told us. We as organisations have a responsibility, a shared responsibility to make this something that's easily done. And that public trust is fragile, and it feels a bit fragile to say this at the moment. But we've got the public's trust, and we've got to retain it, or at least earn it in that space too. So, thinking about all this, then, how do we uphold this trust? How do we do this well? And I'm sure there are organisations on this Zoom today that are nailing this. And if you've got some ideas, please share. I think we've got a hive mind of people here that can really learn and grow from one another. But the question I often ask myself is disclosure enough? We're good at that bit, or maybe not, 1 in 4, but we're okay at this bit. But I love this cartoon because it makes me realise that we've become a bit desensitized to disclosing conflicts of interest as well. And so how do we work beyond this notion of disclosure to get to the real management of conflicts of interest? So to do that, the Institute a few years ago, took on the task of really talking to our researchers and looking at how we could do this, maybe not best but maybe a bit differently. And we, being an academic myself, I went back out to the literature and I had a real look at what was happening. And I came across this amazing paper by Komisarov and colleagues. And if you haven't had a chance to hear Paul speak about conflicts of interest, you really should. He's great in this space. And this paper was really great some years ago now, looking at a new thinking and a new process around conflicts of interest. And I looked at this as well as talked to a lot of our researchers, and then also looked at some other literature to say, well, how could we at a reasonably, now big, but at the time smaller medical research institute implement some of this best practice, or at least better practice. And we came up with these 3 really simple steps of doing it, which I'm sure, as I say, many of you in the room are not already doing, but maybe have even built upon. And the first was to disclose all relevant interests, then look at whether that created a conflict, and then manage in a stepwise way. And when we looked at what we meant as a relevant interest, we went again, it became really, really hard and nebulous to pin that down. But this paper defines it as a commitment, goal, obligation, or duty that's related to a particular social role or practice. So in this instance, it's doing your health and medical research. And then the conflict becomes when there's 2 existing interests or coexisting interests that are likely to compel contrary or incompatible outcomes. And even just, I think, thinking about in that broader terms can allow us to see a broader range of kind of conflicts of interest as well. So I'm going to step it through. And again, would love to have this to be a bit more interactive. But if you have any comments or suggestions on how we've done this, I would really love to hear it. We're always open to feedback. So the first step we did was we said to our researchers, and this is all built into a form, which I'm really happy to share if anybody's interested in taking a look. The first step is to disclose all your relevant interests. And, if you're not sure, just write it down, because a relevant interest can seem really nebulous, right? You don't want this huge laundry list, but it's worth thinking about not just the obvious things. And by obvious things, I've kind of made a bit of a tongue-in-cheek reference to the bottle of Grange in your birth year. I always think back to the Barry O'Farrell scandal, and again, the links there, where he received a bottle of Grange in his birth year as a gift, and it was not meant to mediate his decision-making, but people go to that. They go to their bottle of Grange in their birth year. They go to the really big kind of meaty one that they had on their books for years, and then they forget about all the other stuff. So kind of going through relevant interests is a way to step through that. And look, I know that this is hard. I know that it can become really hard to define, and what if you miss things? But I think it's about being a bit intentional and stepwise about it too. And so being really clear that a relevant interest does not constitute a conflict. And even if it did, that is not a problem. We need to really destigmatize this. So have a go at writing down your relevant interests. And I use some examples because people got really lost, and we workshopped a few different examples. Here are some examples. There might be others, but looking at some of your competitive research funding, maybe that's something you want to write down. Some consultancy work, both in your professional life and then in your work life and personal kind of consultancy. Your speaking engagements, paid or unpaid, your paid or unpaid board memberships, personal relationships, direct payments and shareholdings. Again, but they have to be related to the work. So we do this for the MCRI. So I ask people to think about the role they have at the MCRI. How do these relevant interests, only write them down if you think they're even nebulously related to your work. And this is hard. I understand that this is challenging, and the list can get long very quickly. But what it allows you to do is the next step. And that is to go systematically through them and see them for what they are, and look at interdependencies. Look at whether there are things that you hadn't thought about because you went straight to the bottle of Grange in your birth year, or, the big payment you got, without thinking about, other like relational conflicts of interest, which I could see from the chat was kind of the hard ones too. So that's good. And then it allows you to plan for future strategies. So you might have 2 relevant interests that have no bearing on one another right now, but you can see that, actually, I was thinking about putting that grant in. If I do that, those interests have been combined. Okay, I might need to have a forward strategy. It doesn't always work. Sometimes it can be really, really tricky, but it's just a systematic way of thinking about it. And I give the example of, we had someone that had a personal relationship with the head of some sales company of a lab tech, so let's say Thermo Fisher, for example. And at the time, that was a perceived conflict of interest, but because, I'd actually never buy anything from Thermo Fisher, so it's not a problem. Except it turned out you're the head of procurement. And so actually that's something we need to know about, because whilst you might personally not engage with them, the organisation does, and it's a perceived conflict of interest, or it can become real if you're then in negotiations with your partner. That can be quite sticky. And so, I think it's worth doing this because it also triggers other policies too. So I've heard people go, that's not a conflict of interest either, but I do need to register on my gift policy. And that's great too, right? We need to be able to kind of see the interrelatedness. So you've disclosed your relevant interests. You've worked out that 2 or 3 of them or 10 of them, or none, are conflicts of interest at this moment in your work. Now you need to manage them. And so again, it's that stepwise thing, not just going straight to the obvious, but systematically working through it that helps in my mind. Again, when it comes to managing, I think the throwaway line is, I'll disclose my conflict of interest. Great, brilliant first start. But let's start thinking beyond disclosure. Let's make a plan that is specific to the things that you've taken the time to raise, and let's make it practical as well. And let's, if you say I'm going to disclose X, Y, and Z every day, let's give you a template or a disclosure plan to do that, because otherwise this is going to become your full-time job, and that's not very useful. And again, we go back to that notion of disclosure being kind of desensitizing in this space as well. So the normal things we tell people to do are to recuse or withdraw yourself from decisions, of course, very relevant, and ones that we should be doing a lot. To limit or avoid certain relationships, of course, extremely relevant. And I can say that I worked really closely with our legal teams, and it was very interesting. Of course, they have professional obligations to avoid conflicts of interest, which is actually close to impossible in health and medical research, as I see it, and many of you might disagree. But with our clinicians and our researchers wearing so many different hats, to say that just to simply avoid was not really feasible. So limit or avoid is great, but there are other levers we can pull. It's specific to health and medical research. And look, I'm not saying that any one of these is enough. Often you have to do a combination of these, but I just wanted to raise that it's not just the regulars, recuse, withdraw, limit. There are other things you can do too. And one of them is separating roles or modifying responsibilities. We already have it, of course, that clinicians can't recruit or consent their own patients for many reasons, ethical being amongst them, but also through kind of that impact of bias and conflict as well. But you can keep data separate. A lot of our studies are blinded. You could look at how that might be beneficial to keep data personnel blinded or separate so that any bias might not be imparted. Again, I would not use this as the only lever, but just one that you can add in to go beyond disclosure and withdrawing. You can get independent oversight. We had an issue a while ago where we were a bit worried that, this perceived conflict of interest could bias one of our protocols. Well, let's get that checked. Let's send it out to an independent peer reviewer expert in the field and say to them, we're a bit worried about this. Can you take a look and let us know? And, ask them to look for potential bias. And again, that alone isn't enough, but it was a way to start building processes that go beyond, well, I just can't run that trial again. That were really useful. And, we already appoint often independent statisticians as well. And, monitoring, of course, helps as well. And putting in external monitoring can really support this notion of just disclosing, recusing, or withdrawing yourself from decision-making. So hopefully by now you've got a really neat conflict of interest plan. And so our template works through these steps in a nice little table. And then you submit that, and then that should be updated and changed. And please make it practical, right? I had one researcher say to me, I'll just recuse myself from every meeting where X is discussed. But X comes up in every lab meeting. So are you just how does this practically work? You can't attend your own lab meetings anymore. This isn't going to help. So let's do a plan that's specific, and let's make sure it's practical. And really importantly, if you thought you had a plan and it becomes clear that it's not practical, come and talk. Well, I'd say to my staff, come and talk to me, and we'll revise it and adapt and learn, rather than it being this set and forget scenario. Okay, so we've talked about what individuals can do, and we're going to now round it out. Just looking at the time. Okay, we're going really well. About what organisations can do, because it's really easy to say we've got a policy, we've got some training, and we've got a form. Off you go. And look, that's also fine. If that's what you got, great start. Let's start there. That's wonderful. But as we've seen with some of these cases, organisations do have, I think, obligations to help their researchers in this space. So when we set about looking at this at the MCRI, we decided to use this culture change strategy from the Open Sciences Network. I think this has been presented, I'm sure, before many times, which kind of does this top-down approach of, let's start with the policy. Well, actually, it's the last thing you should do, but that's okay. Let's make it required. Then let's make it rewarding. But what we often do is we go straight to the policy. We get the policy and the training, and we wipe our hands of it. But there are other things we can do to change culture in organizations. And I like to use this in any kind of change management I'm doing to try and hit home culture change, not just practice change. And so I'd love your thoughts on whether any of this resonates with you. But I like to start with making it possible and easy, the first two bottom rungs of the pillar. We made a conflict of interest form that was, people got our feedback, they said it was simple and easy to use. And then we put it into a automated database, and then all of that ease of use went out the window. People said, oh, but I wanted to mark it up or put in comments and then send it to my line manager so we could track changes and have back and forth. I can't do that anymore. So that was a system that was simple and easy for me, but was no longer simple and easy for our researchers. So we actually went back to the Word document, which created a bit of data entry, but that's okay, because we want to make this as simple and as easy as possible, and to really stimulate discussion. So we, said go to your line manager first, have a chat with them. But if you're not sure, come and talk to legal, myself. We're a small enough organisation, we can do that. But I would go back and look at who it says to discuss management or conflicts of interest with, because your line manager is a great start. But what if they don't know either, or they need some guidance? I remember reading a policy that said to go and talk to the executive director of some head of governance to go and discuss conflicts of interest. And the volunteer I was sitting with was like, oh, I'm not going to go and bother a member of the executive of this. And so it wasn't easy. It wasn't possible for them to actually do that. And look, if you can, and you've got the infrastructure, remind them to update it. That can be like annual reminders if you can. I've just something caught my eye in the chat about bureaucracy. I feel you. It's simple and easy. Can sound like a pipe dream. But do remind people up to update it. We looked at annual reminders, and we've tried that. It's hard. We don't necessarily have the infrastructure to do that. We're working on that. But what we do now is I work with our legal teams that every time we get, say, a speaker engagement or a contract that makes them think, there's no conflict of interest here, it gets CC'd to integrity, and we use that as an opportunity to remind people to update their conflict of interest form. So just kind of making it as simple as possible. And then the next step is to make it normative in my mind. And one way to do that is that people just need to do this. And like, again, I don't want us to be overwhelmed by disclosures of conflict of interest, but I always want to see leadership in particular, top down leading this work and getting them to do it publicly and regularly. And we ended up going back through all of our templates and putting in placeholders in all of our slide decks. And it just, again, prompts people to do it, makes it normal to do agenda templates, minute templates, grant checklists. And I'm sure this is work you've all done in your space as well. And finally, make it rewarding. This is a bit more challenging given the the bureaucracies of the work we live in. But it is worth thinking about how can your organization make it rewarding and not scary, or at least not a barrier to doing this right. So I would always say if someone comes to you and discloses a clanger, to try and ride through that and work with them to do it. But also we've implemented some research integrity awards every year. We call out a couple of people that we think can really come forward and embody the spirit of research integrity. So don't know if it's driving change, but it's certainly a nice thing to be able to do. And importantly, we've embedded it into our hiring and promotion. So we're now asking about research integrity broadly, but of course, conflict of interest management is one way of doing that into our hiring and promotions to make it rewarding, because we know that that's what drives culture change. Okay. And then once you've done all of that, technically you're meant to write the policy, but we all know that the NHMRC says start with the policy, and that's fine. And that's what we've done. So hopefully you've got that policy document. Hopefully it's easily available. Hopefully it's in language that's easily understood. And hopefully you've got some guides to help people work through it as well. And if you don't, well, then that's an easy one we can sort out. Okay, now I want to spend a little bit of time, because obviously this is the way the MCRI does it, but we might be totally, clicking bananas. I don't know. We've worked with our researchers and our legal team and actually commercialization more recently to think about how we do this. But I wanted to now turn the tables on you and to ask you to reflect on, how do you think your organization's going? And again, there's so many of us that I'm going to get us to do it via some polls. So when we think about disclosure, how easy is it to disclose? Think about the job you have, either as a researcher or head of legal or, ethics manager. How easy is your organization made it or possible to disclose conflicts of interest? And I've got like a Likert scale there. So strongly agree, neither disagree or agree because you're not sure, or you just don't have an opinion on it, disagree or strongly agree. And I say this not to like kind of make you feel bad, but just to hopefully give you a sense that this is an area that everyone sort of is in a different kind of maturity or element with, and that they need to embrace that and think about ways we might make it easier. How are we looking, Sophie, with the...
I've got 70% so far.
Right. Okay.
A little bit longer.
Yeah, we'll give it another second. And whilst I do that, I'm going to very quickly look at some of the questions too. Whistleblowers, yeah, that's really important. I can only speak for what we do here. We have a external whistleblower hotline. That's really been invaluable for us, because of course the protected disclosures legislation is quite strict on that. Yeah, it's hard. I think Australia's whistleblower, I mean, I don't get anything too political about this, but I think Australia could strengthen its whistleblower protections. And the US has, of course, done a lot of work in that space. Let's close this poll. Let's see how easy are people finding it. Sorry. See it? Okay, we're middling. That's good. We've got nice, the bell curvy kind of skew towards the agree side. Okay, well, to those of you that are strongly agreeing, I'd love to put you in the chat how you're doing that. What makes it so good and easy? And for those of you, if you're feeling brave, who strongly disagree, what are the barriers to that? Is it that you don't know how to feed that back up, or you're not the process owner? What do we think is making it hard? I do find automation a really interesting aspect of this. So we automate things in online forms to make it easy for the people receiving them, but I find them quite hard to fill out and discuss with my line manager. So that's an interesting one. Yeah, great. Got some good things coming up here. Okay. So these are all good ideas, and I'm going to look at the chat and see what we can implement into our own practices too. And I hope you're doing the same. Okay. So let's say, 44% of people said we're pretty good at this. And then the others were around, either agreeing or disagreeing. So we're looking good in how easy we make it to disclose. Let's do the next thing of culture change. What about making it normal? How normative is it? How expected is it in your workplace? Oh, I need to change the slide, sorry. To disclose conflicts of interest. Have a think about this. Very good. Got some great chat happening about where it's easy and difficult. Yeah, disclosure's easy, management's hard. Very good. Reminders are coming in. You're right, reminders are hard though, because they're at one point in time. We've started, like I said, linking into our legal team to say, can you just shoot me through an email and use this as an opportunity? Easier said than done in big organizations though. All right, let me talk about normative again. So can you, Sophie, can you tell me, how's the poll looking?
Yeah, good. We're sort of slowed down, so I'll share it.
Please. Okay, sure. We're getting a similar spread. That's good to see. So the majority of people are saying it is normal. It is the expected standard to do that. And you know what? That does not surprise me. For a talk promoted through Health Translation Queensland, of course, we're getting a lot of health services, I'm sure, and universities and MRIs doing this work. What I'm hoping is it is normative to disclose that. Again, for the people who are nailing this, is there one thing you did or two things you did? For us, it was putting templates into the PowerPoint presentation. It sounds weird, but just reminding people when they build a PowerPoint slide to talk about their conflicts of interest really helped. We also got people to write disclosure statements that said, again, it was a point in time, but they could then copy and paste that into journals. So it was just, really normal to disclose. And to those of you who strongly disagree, what is it? Is it easy to say that leadership doesn't do it, so the rest of us doesn't? Should we be tackling our lab heads here? Should we be talking to heads of department? Or do we build culture from the ground up and talk to our students and postdocs and get them to make this normative going forward? And if I look down, annualizing the process has made it become a bit normal, hasn't it? And I can see that's a really strong way to do it. Oh, good. You've got some easy online forms. Thanks, Lisa. That's great. Okay. So we're making it mostly easy. We're making it mostly normative. Let's get to I think the hardest one to do. And let's move on to rewarding. Because this is a real challenge. Do we reward and staff for coming forward? Do we reward them maybe globally in research integrity or just in conflicts of interest in general? I used to be a health and safety rep, and we used to do this thing called, instead of near miss, we called it a good catch. And I really liked the reframing of that. We're celebrating, we're calling it a good catch. And I think we did, that was right, cinema vouchers for the best catch of the month. You do something like that with conflict of interest management? I don't know. But it would be nice to turn around the language around conflicts of interest being a dirty word to being something that's rewarded for coming forward. Great. I'm just looking at the chat. Apologies, I'm trying to juggle here, but it's looking like, okay, for medical staff, getting online, getting the COI training available as part of the CPD. I could not agree more. This is a professional skill that we should be, rewarding people's time with, and at least giving them the time to do it. I could not agree more. Do you want to close that poll for us, Sophie, if that's looking good? Would the reward need to be declared? Fantastic. Yeah, we'd make it under the $50 limit. Don't worry, cool. Thanks for that. Okay, so rewarding environment. Let's have a look. Okay. So we're starting to get towards them. We're not particularly sure, and maybe we're not actually doing that. So that's great. Hopefully, if a minimum you come out of this, should it not be a statutory requirement? Yeah, and that's an interesting comment. It is probably a statutory requirement, but that doesn't necessarily mean people do it, right? So let's try and pull the other lever of making it rewarding. Okay, so we've got a bit of a skew now, and I'd encourage you to go away and think about how maybe your organizations or you as researchers, what you would like to see in this space, and write to your head of integrity, sorry for all of you on the line, and say, here's how you can make this a more rewarding environment, because I think this is the bit that gets proper culture change in organizations. I'm going to close this now. So thank you all for taking the time to do that. It's something that we did with our own organizations. And as I said, I don't think we've nailed it 100%. I talk to legal and commercialization all the time, especially around spin-offs with research. How do we create a really healthy environment for spinning off companies and creating conflicts of interest plans that really help prevent and preempt that? It's going to be really important. But hopefully you can go and take away, we need to make it more rewarding, and think and turn your mind to how to do that, and with some resources to do it too. Okay, so we're rounding it out. We've got 15 minutes left, and I wanted to leave time for questions because I can see there's heaps of chat going on, which is great. The take-home message is, for me, that conflicts of interest are not inherently bad. In fact, they're actually the realities of modern research. As I said, I have 3 appointments. That is going to, create needing to disclose relevant interests or conflicts of interest as well. So conflicts of interest are not inherently bad. It's how we acknowledge them and manage them that then matters. I would ask us to think beyond statutory obligations, think beyond disclosure as the start, and go towards this kind of shared accountability if we can. And I know that's hard in rigid organizations, but just if there's one thing we can do to shift the needle towards a better culture, let's do that work. And I don't mean to get needlessly political, but it has never been this hard nor this important to do this work. I understand that when I talk to my researchers and say to them, you need to disclose that, lunch that the or afternoon tea that you got taken out for by the drug company because you guys had 100% recruitment rate or whatever it was this year, that they look at me and they're just like, are you kidding me? Have you not turned on the news? It is fairly galling to be telling our researchers to do that when we are seeing really publicly some of the biggest erosions of trust when it comes to conflicts of interest. And of course, I've got some links there to that. And I'm not just picking on the Americans. Of course, in Australia, we've had our fair share of scandals too. And we need to be really aware that having this conversation when we are just seeing such rampant mismanagement of conflicts of interest is really challenging. But it is also just so important. Today's research environment has never been more complex. The funding environment, the publishing environment, it is hard. And so this is so important when we're operating in that environment. And it's so important because trust is fragile and precious. And if we don't get this right, we can really walk away from the trust that health and medical research has built in our communities with our patients and our families. So hopefully that's hit home for you today as well. Okay, so that's the end of me speaking. I've put my email address up there if you'd like to reach out. I'd love to know if you're doing this different, better. If you want to share policies, happy to take a look. All of our policy, our conflict of interest forms and our templates are under a CCBY license. Happy to share, happy for you to share. So if you would like to do that, please reach out. Would also love to hear what you're doing in this space that I haven't thought about, because I'm sure there's a million things I haven't thought about. What if you think I'm bonkers and that actually disclosing all your relevant interests is a giant waste of time? Let me know. I want to hear. But I do want to open it up for Q&A. So let me pull that across. And yes, to those who asked for a copy of the presentation, of course, I will provide that. And I apologize. Those of you who've seen me speak before, I normally do a lot more interaction, but I think we have close to 400 people on the Zoom, and breakout rooms might have broken poor Sophie. So thank you for having me today. Okay, so let's go through some of these questions, if that's okay. What legal, financial and governance support is available? So we've talked about whistleblowers. I could not agree with you more that Australia needs to really dig deep and look at its whistleblower protections. And I think that's something that, we can't drive as a sector in health and medical research, that we need to drive nationally. I look at countries like the US that financially recompense their whistleblowers, and I think that is just transformative, and I think we need to think about how we do that. But I agree that we're not doing great in this space. Researchers ask a question, but in medical research, sometimes we are asked to review via the HREC and a hypothesis that includes the personal opinions of the researcher. Yeah, okay, get that. The question's not open and independent, instead reflective of the personal interests, personal beliefs. This is really hard. Thanks, Jan. I might hope I'm saying your name right. And this is really hard because personal beliefs are really hard to dissociate from your research endeavors. Of course, I'm working in a health and medical research environment with kids because that's what I'm passionate about. I have kids, love kids. How do I dissociate that from my work? Is really, really challenging. I think that's where things like unbiased peer review get really important, and also being able to point to best practice. But these are all things that we know. It's a genuine challenge, and I would really love the funders to uplift on how we're following a research agenda that is actually really important to Australians. And I think consumer engagement and involvement does that in a way that we haven't seen before. So what questions do our patients, our families and our colleagues want answered? And how do we weight that to make sure that we're answering the questions relevant to our patients and families is really key. Okay, Rebecca, hopefully that answers your question. Please let me know if I haven't put more in there. Rebecca's asked, what is the best possible way to deal with decentralized trial? Yeah. So you've got a site somewhere else and involved in recruitment. Yeah. Someone is dealing with patients directly and involved in recruitment, but also employed by the sponsor. So hopefully the PI is employed by the organization. And so they're still receiving funds from the sponsor to conduct that trial and their wage, but hopefully they're not, of course, personally benefiting, but that money is going into a research cost center that's then used to fund the research directly and ongoing. I don't know about this one. I'd be really to let anyone that's receiving direct payments to be doing that sort of work on a product they're trialing, but I'd want to see the details of that. I will say one of the challenges with conflict of interest management in trials is that often people will say, oh, I'll recuse myself or I'll withdraw. And then you look back at GCP or good clinical practice, and they can't actually do half of the requirements of what a PI is meant to do. So we need to manage conflicts of interest, but if it means that they can't meet their obligations as a PI, we're going to have a serious conversation about whether they can accept funding to this sorts of research. And I'm not very popular when that happens. I was involved in a grant which involves, this is an anonymous attendee. Really hard to find experts. So I feel you. Medical research it's huge, right? Because it's global, but also when we're working on protein ABC and there's only like 11 experts and 3 of them work in your lab or in your organization, because that's what organizations do. They kind of build pockets of expertise. It gets really hard. I totally agree that this expertise in small fields creates conflicts of interest. The way I like to try and manage that, and it's not foolproof, is of course blind peer review. So sending to people without your name on it. I don't know how often that works. I think that's really challenging. But also I think just being really honest and saying, yes, there's a perceived conflict of interest because they have expertise in this field, but we don't have any other experts that we can send this to. And of course, leaning on international colleagues is helpful, but you should be collaborating with them too if it's a niche field. I don't have an answer to that one, I'm sorry. But I think if anyone else has a plan, please put it in the chat and we can come up with a solution together. But blinding peer review can really help, I think. Top considerations for spin-out companies. Thank you for that question. We are going through that at the moment. It's really hard. It's really hard because they're competing interests, right? Talk about organizational conflict. We are really working with our PIs that have previously spun out and are kind of asking for their reflections on what did and didn't work, so that from moving forward, when we spin out a company, we are sitting down with PIs and saying, spin out's great. We want you to spin out. That's kind of, even the NHMRC and MRFF is asking you to do that. How can we set you up for success? So how can we make sure that you have enough separation in your role, or that you have other expertise you can lean on, or other members of the lab that you can delegate to, so that you're then not totally blocked out of running trials in your own kind of domain and space. So for me, the top considerations is that early engagement, and I think being really, really honest and open to the fact that this does create inherent tension, but it doesn't have to be bad. And if we work with you to manage it, that we can do that. And we've got an amazing head of IP who I meet with regularly to talk about this. And we are coming up with some guidelines that when we're going through the spin out process or attributing IP, that we can start thinking about conflicts of interest then, not waiting until they get their, grant or they get their seed funding for their company and then come to us and say, I've got a conflict. So maybe I could come and give this talk again in 6 months and I can tell you what we came up with. But if anyone else has any ideas, please do sing out and let me know. But engage early and engage openly, I think would be my biggest consideration. Is it considered a conflict of interest of a researcher who is an inventor or patent? Okay, so commercialization. Yeah, I mean, that's a great follow-on question. It's really challenging. And so when we're assigning IP, when we're assigning things like equity stake, we need to be having upfront conversations about what that means for their future research in that area, and what that means for managing their conflicts of interest. We haven't nailed this yet. I don't think my head of IP would be upset with me for saying that. We're working on it. And like I said, if you want to collaborate on that, we're a small sector. Please do. If you've got great ways of doing this, let's reach out and do it together. Yeah. Are there any more questions? I'm looking at the chat. Excellent. Yep, happy to provide a copy of all the links and the presentation. I think this is being recorded, so happy to, of course, provide that. I'm glad to hear it was practical and useful. And please sing out again if you have any ideas or thoughts that we can do it differently. I'm going to give you 5 minutes back. I'll stay on the line. If more chats come up, please let me know. But I can't believe I finished early. Really go and eat lunch, have a cup of coffee, But I'll quickly hand over to Sophie to close us out. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you so much, Nitya, and thank you everyone who joined us today. I do hope that today's discussion was valuable to you all and that it somehow supports your own research practice. A recording will be provided, as well as any of the resources that Nitya shared today or mentioned. I will do that after the session, so just keep an eye out for your emails. And yeah, keep an eye out as well for any of our other Health Translation Queensland events that are coming up on our events page. I'll also link that to you as well, because we would love to see you all again. Thanks, and once again, I'll have a good rest of your day. Thank you all. Thank you, Nadia.